Salve and welcome to Rauta's retrospective videos. This time we go to Norway, and this is based very much on the idea that Carpathian Forest was one of the first bands ever to be interviewed on Rauta, or featured in the first place, because technically speaking Rauta started with interviews already back in 2017. So roughly 8 years later, here we are with the very first band, or one of the very first bands that was included on the channel, and really still to this day very thankful to Mr. Natterfrost featured on the channel. I mean, after all, there was nothing really to show for back in the days when we just founded the whole channel, and yet still this gentleman gave me his time and presence with me to talk on the channel. Now, obviously, since ever that, I have done another interview which you might have also seen. And this time it's time to do a little bit of a payback, meaning we're gonna go through Carpathian Forest discography, past, present, history whatsoever, and talk about their music, their lyrics, their cover image and all. You know the drill if you've seen previous retrospective videos, and if you haven't, well, this will be your first one, a virgin run. Without further ado, let's tune in for Metal Archive site for Carpathian Forest. After all, this is very much of a good backdrop to talk about the very band, talk about the music, the changes, etc. But where to start? I guess the good starting point would be going to back into the early 90s when the band was operating with a different name. Now, we're not gonna touch the preceding versions of any given band when we're talking about a retrospective thing, so we'll move to 1992 instead of 1990 when the band was operating under a different name. But in case you want to see what Metal Archives has to say about it, well, not much. You have Black Winds. Does it resonate with you with the blasphemy and all? Well, that is kind of a pointless here. The point here is nothing much was happening prior to Carpathian Forest in terms of black metal from this band and or place. And originally, obviously, the band was a little bit different. You had Norwegian on bass and other instruments back in the days, vocals backing, etc. Guitars, of course. And then you had not the Frost taking care of some of the stuff, including vocals, but also guitars, keyboards, what have you. So it was like these two guys, kind of a similar duo, dynamic one, if you will, as what Darkthrone had with, pretty much Nocturnal Calder and Fenris, or what Satyricon had with, or still have with, Frost and Satyr. There are lots of these great duo bands, including, but not limited, of course, Immortal as well. So Norway definitely had already this kind of duo mentality for a lot of other bands. The list could be, going beyond these examples, but that is just to give you a little bit of a example to showcase that sometimes dynamic duos are exactly what is needed to have in order to create some interesting black metal. But let's go back to 1992 when the band was pretty much founded, and that's when they had their very first demo released to the public, Bloodlust and Perversions, having a few songs out there, and obviously music wise rather rough in terms of black metal. I mean, this is how you got it back in the days more than 30 years ago. Covers were simple, kind of a Xerox copied, corpse paints, nails, what have you. Pretty typical stuff. What is interesting, however, that lyrically, Carpathian Forest was a little bit different animal than it would be later on. Technically speaking, not so different from a lot of other bands back in the days. I mean, if you look at these lyrics, for example, of some of the songs here, like Return of the Freezing Winds, which they still played later on, there's some kind of a romanticism included. I mean, we're talking about the Norwegian mountains and landscapes and all that stuff, and things are not that hostile, really. And what became later on as their trademark, being like somewhat dark humor, sadomasochism, and all that stuff, that wasn't present so much. Musically, however, these were the kind of first steps. The band was getting into something. Personally, I don't care too much about Bloodlust and Perversion demo or the rehearsal outtake that was released soon after that. Maybe not even meant for the public. but it is what it is. And as you can see here, it has a battery cover and Venom cover and some of the material that was already recorded before that. Then they went to do another demo 1993, and that's where the doors started opening. They moved to really EP length with Through Chasm, Caves and Titan Woods. This is, to many people what I've been talking to about the band, the best release by Carpathian Forest ever. It was like a big step up from those early rough demo years, and things started going differently. And here you have somewhat of a classic cover. I mean, you have this Viking historical structure on a pile of rocks that is a mountain, and some trees right there. Curious enough, the logo was here kind of ugly if you ask me. And also, what is this pink color? We're not talking about the details, just pointing out some funny things over the years. But this is where it really got started. Now, however, this band wasn't the quickest of them all to move on to an album thing. I mean, if you compare to a lot of bands from Norway that already had albums out like 1991 or 1993 and all that stuff, well, let's just say that Carpathian Forest took their time, and it was as late as 1998. A year or era when a lot of people would be saying, yeah, Norwegian black metal had gone into shit, lost its crown, moved to different directions. And that's pretty much what Carpathian Forest like, hey, are we a little bit late to the party? Like, whatever happened to these other bands, Immortals and Mayhems and Dark Thrones and shit like that? Things were changing quite quickly. I mean, for example, if you take a look at, say, Emperor, they lasted for some 10 years. By 1998, they was pretty much on the twilight of their career, where Carpathian Forest was starting, which is kind of curious because they actually had it going on since 1990. But like I said, sometimes things take time. Now, for me personally, I think Black Shining Letter is one of the best releases. And I've been going through their whole discography a few times over the years, and I am still not sure which album is the best. This kind of tells something about the consistency, but also maybe about my mind. Sometimes I think it's this album. Sometimes I think, no, it's the next one, and so forth. But here it started going a little bit different compared to the EP. But first, let's take a look at the cover. You have seen the black and white image of this skeleton, and then basically nothing but a logo, and inverted colors, obviously, negative colors, as they say. And what was also interesting, that musically they were very much leaning on to early Celtic Frost. So not a CF coming into play. Sometimes people talk to CF, meaning Celtic Frost, Celtic Frost in some dialects. And sometimes people are obviously referring to Carpathian Forest. Be it a coincidence or not, I still find it funny how much the music is leaning to Carpathian Forest, leading to Celtic Frost, that is. Now, musically, this is very, very much the mid-tempo, bass-driven black metal, and as such, I think they kind of made their own unique sound over the years. They made always sure that the bass is very audible, very strong, like a backbone, which is supposed to be, whereas a lot of black metal bands were like, bass? Do we even need one? Does it need to be audible? And I think this is one of the forte things on Carpathian Forest release. They have the bass, and it's strong, it's powerful. What is also very curious is that they made this very, very cool Tekir cover to end the album with. Was not exactly the most typical way to do it. Given how many black metal bands were just focusing being black metal, no covers, and especially not some pop songs, But they made it, and this is a good one, really good one. In my opinion, it's one of the examples what I use when I'm talking about metal bands doing a non-metal cover, how you do it properly, and this is exactly that. But what about their own music? Now, this was already changing, not just musically, but also lyrically. Here you have, for example, Sadomasochistic or Pierced Genitalia. Doesn't sound really like your typical black metal songs, which is about anti-Christianity or history, the pagan swords kind of a thing. So a lot of things were missing in sense of being Nordic black metal band. So Carpathian Forest were early on, given that this was, after all, their debut album, going to a different place. So they had already abandoned, to a certain degree, their lyrical output when it comes to being romantic about the landscapes and frozen woods, mountains, what have you, which were present early on. I mean, for this review or retrospective thing, I really read pretty much all the lyrics I could find easily. And I was paying a little bit of attention how much they changed over the years. And once again, if you look at these lineup things, you will see Frost and Norwegian, like brothers in a way. Even the songwriting is divided among the two guys, and both have multiple roles. So it's, for me, very, very interesting because I've been playing in bands that are just made by duo. Anyhow, let's move on. 2000s, now 2 years separation only. And they kept the thing going on. They didn't change that much. There's also the same kind of theme going on. You know, you had like Mask of the Slave and the Suicide Song. So it's flirting with these taboos like suicide, for example. But it's also featuring these sadomasochistic themes and some other weird ideas. Also, interestingly, theme from Necromantic movie done as a cover. So once again, going to a different kind of set of cover in terms of being a black metal band. And then they finally nailed the album with this so-called bonus track, He's Turning Blue, which is, in my opinion, maybe their best song ever. I mean, it's really catchy. It's kind of a dark humor one, but it's a very good one. And at this point, they had nailed their aesthetics a little bit different. They made this Chaos logo with CF, which is strikingly good in my opinion. Some people actually thought once upon a time, not too long time ago in fact, if I had a Carpathian Forest, because I have this Bullet Chaos Star logo, and someone was thinking if I'm Carpathian Forest to that degree. No, I'm not, but it was funny that it's so iconic that people kind of remember it by the spikes and the 8-pointed design, and as such, their mind is going to that place when they see something similar. Here are present also the guys in the cover. I don't think this is actually a great cover, but this use of their symbol is pretty cool, and for a degree, I actually like it. But Strange Soul Brew wasn't so much of a step up. In my opinion, it was pretty much staying true to their earlier albums, so kind of a natural successor. Then, in my opinion, it started a little bit to decline. Not much, but a little bit. Morbid Fascination of Death came very quickly after the second album, 2001, only 1 year later. And once again, they would feature quite a bit of songs and including a cover. This time, however, doing a black metal cover, which isn't bad, obviously, but disappointment in the sense of sometimes before that doing a couple of covers outside of the typical thing, even including the Venom one early on. And here you have certain similar themes as back in the days, the previous albums, like, True Self-Mutilation and all these things like Morbid Fascination of Death. So there is this thing going on, being very morbid, kind of a dark humor, and being kind of not giving a fuck so much about the topics here. And of course, along the years, they actually included some of the anti-Christianity in their lyrics, but not overwhelmingly so, as opposed to a lot of other bands coming from the same country or same era of black metal bands. So while they started a little bit late with their albums, 1998, by 2001 they had 3 albums out. So they were picking up the pace, even if a lot of Norwegian bands had moved on to different things or even ceased to exist in their previous form. And this time they also used this Carpathian Forest symbol, and now more skulls and a little bit of anti-Christianity with these edged weapons. Now pay attention, this is a funny anecdote. See this, among the skulls you have the one corpse paint guy. I don't know if it's a joke or is it just something of their dark humor in other ways, but it's kind of a hilarious. Skulls, 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 skulls. What? Corpse paint. Be it as may, here it is. Then they started doing what other bands had been doing before them, compiling things into one. They already had Bloodlust and Perversions compilation in 1997, putting their demos and shit into one compilation. Makes sense after all, since demos are very limited in their early original format. But 2002, more compilations going in and all that stuff. And in my opinion, they went even further on decline when they did Defending Throne of Evil. Once again, not much, But still, I would say what started with the two first albums started going a little bit on decline and feeling like the band is losing something. And here, if you take a look, this might be actually explaining it. Now, there is not the first present of their dynamic duo, but with some other interesting people. And mind you, Court and Andrew Scobro, they are no newbies to the genre, but they are not known as the Carpathian Forest core, if you will. Now, once again, using the Carpathian Forest symbol on the cover, and then a little bit of a weird photo with, skulls and shit. It's almost like, hey, now internet is picking up with these kind of photos, and it's like, dude, that's not that great at what you had previously. And once again, this was only 2 years after the previous ones. Once again, more than 10 songs, and of course, more than 50 minutes. And these themes that are here, they kind of moved on from the sadomasochistic or BDSM, whatever stuff, and of course, a little bit anti-Christian in the making, but they were changing only little. Basically, they were keeping it true, which is of course great if you like consistency, but they were changing. And what I was saying about the lineup things, I mean, here you had not the first and Norwegian, in case I forgot to mention, but you also had these three other guys. So the band was kind of growing until it wasn't. And that's pretty much, if you take a members list, look for past members, Norwegian left around 2000. So in terms of first 10 years, very much present and suddenly no more. Now 10 years now feels like a short amount of time when you're thinking the band has been here for 35 years. But back in the day, it was kind of shocking that you would actually lose the other half of the whole band. So thinking like that, first 10 years, two guys focusing, doing everything here until it wasn't. And as such, the dynamics of the whole band was changing. Maybe that is why Morbid Fascination of Death isn't that good of an album. I don't know. People speculate a lot of that, and I guess it has to be there. Or maybe it's because Defending the Throne of Evil was going in a little bit decline because of that. Hard to tell for sure. Now, on a side note, I want to just put this here as well, because this is worth mentioning. Always when we're talking about rating albums, I don't take Metal Archives reviews that seriously because it's only few takes. I mean, if you look at these reviews, you might see Black Shining Leather is only 63%. So average albums. Strange Old Brew even less than that. And suddenly Morbid Fascination of Death with 5 votes is 81. And Defending the Throne of Evil 88. Gives you quite a different idea what I'm talking about. However, if you go for the list based how they are reviewed in bigger numbers, we're talking about hundreds of people or even more than that, Black Shining Leather is rated as the highest with 3.4 almost. For me, as you can see, Fuck You All is the least rated, but it is one of the better for me. And Strange Old Brew being 3.26 is their second least rated. So maybe there is something going on. I don't know. What I'm saying here is that with Fuck You All, that came 2006, 3 years later than the fourth album, Defending the Throne of Evil, well, now it was, of course, with a little bit of different lineup. Once again, not the first leading things and these other guys playing along with no added member. And songwriting, as such, being a little bit different than the early works. And here, once again, you have quite a different take on the cover. And this is almost weird. Like, you have these, male body with the penis-like thing going up. You have these insect images here, a little bit inverted cross and all that stuff. And then you just like Fuck You All, which is kind of a funny or ridiculous title for a black metal release. However, be it as it may, in my opinion, this is one of the better ones. And maybe it's so much like later on when I started to like this a little bit more than all that stuff. And talking about the romanticism which I mentioned earlier, the Frostbitten Woodlands of Norway. Get my point here. So while they had these changes from, the early romanticism going into sadomasochism, violence, death, and all that stuff, and morbid humor, they also kind of never left the romanticism out of the question. Now here, if you see themes mentioned as death, check, misanthropy, Yeah, probably so. Nature, definitely. Anti-Christianity, to some degree, yeah. Nihilism, probably so, if you think it from that angle. BDSM and dark humor, definitely. So I'm saying these themes really sum it up the way you just kind of need to have in order to understand what was going on with that. But that also means that the themes have changed over the course of years. And that's kind of a given. 35 years in the making, yeah, of course, things change. What is curious, however, that they didn't make more than 5 albums throughout 35 years. And if you really take a look at this even further, you have all these 5 albums within a span of 10 years, actually less, 1998 to 2006. So it's been almost 20 years since the band released a new album. Why so? Well, there's one thing which was mentioned in my interviews as well, and that's very much the guys doing hard drugs back in the days. And I'm not talking about weed here with a lot random alcohol. I'm talking about them hard drugs. And you can pretty much see how bad shape Natafrost was in the first interview in 2017 as opposed to one we did a few years later. It's like a regenerating guy, getting healthier, but you can still see the scars. Not just literal scars, but the overall presence, how much it has gone through shitty phases. I guess to a certain degree it's a miracle that he lives. No, I don't know if it's a literal miracle. I don't believe in miracles. But I'm saying glad that he did make it alive through that use of hard drugs. That isn't exactly something that it's given. Now, after their 2006 album, there were only live stuff and box sets, so pretty much just going on with non-new material. And then they kind of are returned into form, and I totally disagree with this average rating here, 8%. What the fuck? There's only one song, less than 3 minutes, and a Turbo Necro cover. Unfortunately, the cover is not that good, but it kind of, gives you a little bit of a story about the band's dark humor and all, but it's not that great. And you will know why if you ever listen to Turbo Necro. I mean, it kind of fits the bill, given the previous style of how they went, out of black metal or metal in general with their covers, but kind of unnecessary to have EP where like half of its own material and one other half is the cover. After all, we're talking about the release that came 12 years after the previous album. And this was already 7 years ago. So if you let that sink in for a bit, it seems like we are on the twilight years of the band. Like I said, 35 years if you include the pre-version of the band Enthroned, and still only 5 albums and 19 years since the previous ones. What is curious also worth mentioning here as a side note is that they eventually, redid the logo, which is kind of a messy but also kind of a true to their CF symbol. And I gotta say, I like this one better than the original one, but I guess I also understand if some people prefer the early version. Now, in terms of music, if you want to sum it up from the debut album to the latest one, or even include Through Chasm Caves and Titan Woods, is that the bass-driven, very much Celtic, frost-leaning black metal never changed too much. Obviously, nuance is right there. So, nuance are right there. My point here is, obviously, there are minor changes here and there, and the band has been evolving to some degree. But then again, not too much. They never went too far, like, hey, let's start doing blast beats, because that kind of would feel odd. They never went too melodic, but they still kind of maintained their somewhat catchy and morbid music, the very Norwegian way. So at least what it's worth, this band has always sounded unique in their own style. There are no real comparisons coming from Norway which sound the same. Sure, certain individual things, details or whatever might sound like something else. And if you take a look at the similar artist tab, well, Darkthrone is always mentioned here as first. But to be honest, I don't think they even sound that much Darkthrone. After all, Darkthrone has multiple different eras or phases. Certain eras are very Darkthronian, overall, not so much. About Gorgoroth, I don't really think so. Gorgoroth has always had kind of a different vibe. Certain ideas are overlapping. Why you have then upvoted Darkthrone, if you will, because certain parts really are like that. But as you can see, Darkthrone style has changed, and obviously only certain parts of Darkthrone are similar to Carpathian Forest style. If you then again go through this list, as you're gonna like these bands if you like Carpathian Forest, I think it's mostly because they are always from Norway. Do they have similarities? Fuck no, not that much. Immortal and 1349 for that matter? No way. Urgehal to a certain degree, once again because they're very Darkthronian. But Satyricon, Mayhem? Nah. Imbel Nazarene, maybe because they have the similar morbid humor. Craft? Sure, that I would actually vote here because they once again have the Darkthronian Urgehal link going on. And then down you go to this list like having Enthroned and all that stuff. Not really. I guess the closest one is Netherfrost's own band, which did some music but not as good as Carpathian Forest because they do have similarities. But I guess the only reason Celtic Frost is not here higher in the ranking is that Celtic Frost also changed their style over the years, and as such didn't really I don't know why my vote is not happening here. And I think that is not reflected that much. The overall thing. I mean, if we're talking about later Celtic Frost albums or even the mid era, well, they don't really sound like Carpathian Forest. No, the other way around. But there are similarities. My point is basically, if you like Darkthrone's Panzerfaust album, which is very Celtic Frost-like, if you do like Celtic Frost, now the vote happened here with the lag. If you do like early Celtic Frost, or maybe even Hellhammer to a certain degree, yeah, you probably would like Carpathian Forest if you're newbie to that. And it's also kind of fascinating that a lot of people kind of dislike Carpathian Forest because they went too much maybe into dark humor, they made too much into hard rocks and all that shit. I don't know. For me, it's always been more of a good band than anything else. But also, I have to say, in my opinion, they never made fantastic albums. That is to say, they did do some classic albums, but did they really make the ones that you would compare to, say, the Mysteries to Sathanas, or Under a Funeral Moon, or Pure Holocaust kind of stuff? Unfortunately, no. But still, overall, a good band, and entertaining live, and also features some nice guys. Now, worth mentioning is, because we did this interview back in the days, also a couple of years ago with Steelface, is that if you take a look at this, drums, Svartjärn, guitars, Svartjärn, guitars, also Svartjärn, and then one other member. So there is a strong Svartjärn connection with the band, which is, by the way, a good Norwegian band. And if you're still thinking about it, why Svartjärn guys are the right ones to do the music, the name lies here in the demo 1993. Journey Through Cold Moors of Svartjärn. So there it is. This is my take on Carpathian Forest, with the covers, with the lyrics, with the music and basics. Now, if I got you interested, good. If I didn't, fuck me and all that. I still hope that you will give my Carpathian Forest interviews a chance. I think they were interesting conversations back in the days. So dive into the world of Carpathian Forest musically as well as interview-wise, and I hope you like it. More retrospective videos coming your way once I have done a little bit more listening and all that stuff. Now, off you go, and bye-bye.